that she was raised? And that's a good question for everybody, regardless of our stage in life. Are we acting at that moment? Are we making choices that are in line with the teachings of Jesus? Are they in line with the values that we profess? This introspective exercise, many psychologists claim that it speaks to the way that we've been raised. And sometimes how we develop as we are growing up will facilitate this or not. And for some people, depending on how much they had or how little they had when they were younger in life, it can make this easier or more difficult to do. For those who remember high school psychology, there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs states that we progress in different stages, and you can't get to the next stage until the previous one is fulfilled. So the first stage is that of survival, and that we have that need that needs to be met. We need to be fed, we need to be clothed, we need to have shelter, we need to not worry about how we're going to get the next meal before we could move on to the next stage, and that is of having psychological needs met. So once the survival needs are met, then there's psychological needs that need to be addressed. Self-esteem, self-assurance, self-confidence, and so forth. And then when those are met, then we go into other emotional needs, such as love, to love and to be loved. And then there's spiritual needs wrapped into that stage as well. And Maslow has all these up like a pyramid. You might remember that from the textbook when you read it. And at the very top of the pinnacle, at the pinnacle of the pyramid is self-actualization. To be a self-actualized or self-realized individual means that all these other steps have been fulfilled. And you have been able to spend some time reading poetry, contemplating lofty ideas, taking a look at the mirror and saying, who am I and where do I want to go, and what are the values that will help me get there? Now, the thing is that we know that in our society and throughout the world, there are certain neighborhoods, certain communities, certain regions where not all of these needs are met. And some people living in war-torn regions are truly in the first stage. They're trying to see how they're going to survive. In some other areas where homes are being flooded and there's mudslides and so forth, it's hard to read poetry when the waters are rising. Now, before Maslow, though, it was common sense that these things have to be fulfilled in order for there to be progress. Before Maslow even wrote his theses, civilizations were sprouting out throughout the world, each at different times, where they were striving to improve the quality of life and make it so that their children could one day flourish, so that their children could one day contemplate lofty ideals. Several years ago, I went to the city of Cordoba. Cordoba is in the southern part of Spain. And Cordoba is a very, very old city. It's one of the older cities in that Iberian Peninsula. The Romans first established it. During the Roman Empire, they had Spain as part of the territory. And in Cordoba, they set up an office for trade, for the collection and distribution of goods. And they found that site to be a good site, and so they started to develop it. You go to Cordoba today, you could see the Roman aqueducts. You could see some of their street gutters and some of their infrastructure back from the 3rd and 4th century, 5th century, that show how advanced Roman engineering was. Somewhere around the 8th century, the southern part of Spain was conquered by the Moors. Who were the Moors? The Moors were basically nomadic tribes from northwest Africa. And they moved into the Iberian Peninsula and they started to conquer it. And they spent over 700 years in the southern part of Spain. Now, if you think that Roman architecture and Roman engineering was impressive, then you would be flabbergasted at the engineering of the Moors. The Moors has engineering that's way surpassed any engineering of its time. And as you walk through Cordoba, it's just going through the streets. Some of those streets are original bricks laid by the Moors. And they had a style that was very, how should I say, innovative. Instead of laying the bricks out horizontally, they would lay them vertically, because that would allow for water from the rain to seep down into the ground, cool the ground, and therefore cool the atmosphere. So as you're walking through Cordoba, there's all these bricks that, to the sight, you can't tell, but these were bricks that are easily 18 inches long and go vertically down. And they had a system of gutters and rooftops that allowed for the distribution of water, so that as it rained, water would be channeled into different canals, different shallow pools, out to irrigate the fields, and it would be used in cisterns and so forth for daily living. And they had a way of taking a look at what would be the hottest part of the city and planting trees there. I mean, truly social engineering to improve the quality of life. And by so doing, they met many of the steps of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And eventually, over time, Cordoba became a hub of intellectual thought. When the rest of Europe was trying to deal with the plague and dealing with muddy streets and just dealing with high mortality rates, in Cordoba, they had a very high quality of life that allowed them to produce great thinkers, philosophers, mathematicians, musicians, artists. And they were all in Cordoba and the surrounding towns. And as you go there and visit, you'll see the architecture of that era, and it's quite spectacular. And historically speaking, we know that in that city there were three faiths. There was the Jewish faith, the Islamic faith, and the Christian/Catholic faith. And they all coexisted throughout the 13th and 14th century in Cordoba and surrounding towns. There was like a hub of peace, of tolerance, of diversity. And each faith produced its own philosopher. In the Islamic faith, there was a philosopher by the name of Averroes. In the Jewish faith, there was Maimonides. And in the Catholic one, there was Fabio. And all three of them met, and they exchanged ideas. And they promoted a philosophy of inclusion, of diversity. Now, to tell you the truth, there were conservative movements all around them that thought that they were way too radical. And eventually, Maimonides was kicked out of the region and sent in penitence to other areas and told not to promote those ideas anymore. So this golden age of southern Spain was also happening at the same time that was one of the darkest moments in northern Spain. In northern Spain, there was a fanatical movement happening, and they were spreading throughout the north, conquering through battles all of the northern part of Spain, and they were claiming it. They were claiming it for the monarchy. And then this fanatical movement was one that wanted a homogeneous Spain, that the Iberian Peninsula should all just be one people, one faith, one ethnicity. When you go to Cordoba and you take a look at their mosque, it's a beautiful, beautiful sight. And right smack in the middle of the mosque, there's a cathedral, a Catholic cathedral, surrounded by the mosque and the pillars of the mosque. And sometimes when you look at these pillars and you stand in a certain way, the pillars all line up. And then when you stand in a different way, they create other geometric designs. But when the Catholics came in, they went ahead and they decided not to tear it down, and they put within it a cathedral. The story is pretty much the same story centuries earlier. When the Moors arrived, they found in that very same spot a small chapel back from the days of the Roman Empire. And they decided not to tear that down, but to create their mosque all around it. And so that building is a wonderful physical representation of as to how three faiths could be woven into each other, and how the people could flourish while living side by side. Now, for those of you who know your history, you know that shortly thereafter, the southern part of Spain was conquered by the north, and Ferdinand and Isabella went ahead and developed their monarchy. And you have to ask, how did this happen? How could such a beautiful social experiment that was in this region of the Iberian Peninsula could have been overrun, persecuted, and pushed out? How could the Inquisition have happened? We know that it did happen, But the more important question is, how did it happen? Why did it happen? What were the human elements that were at that time to make it happen? And the answer to that question is in today's gospel lesson. Today's gospel lesson addresses that historical fact. Historical records from medieval times show that the Pope and archbishops and other clerical leaders were preaching words of war to push out the Muslim people and the Jewish people from the Iberian Peninsula in order to create a homogeneous kingdom. Now, you have to ask yourself, was the Bible any different back then? Was the Gospel of Mark read differently than the way we just read it today? How could they have read those words of Jesus and still at the same time push for war, push for what ended up being a genocide of entire groups of people? How could clergy who were leading the holy sacrament of communion be doing so with murder in their hearts? Well, we know that they did not see Cordoba as an intellectual center that promoted peace throughout with diversity and tolerance. We know that they saw Cordoba as a threat. Diversity and tolerance were not the values for the new Spain that they wanted to establish. Now today, with our heightened sense of human rights, we would call medieval Spain an apartheid state. We would call the Inquisition a church-sanctioned fascist movement. If you consider what it must have been like to not be Catholic and not be Spanish and living in Spain during those times of persecution, knowing that you and your family could have gotten killed at any moment. Today we live with the best available engineering that there is. Gutters and rooftops have perfected homes so that the people within them could examine lofty ideas, write poetry, communicate with people clear across the world about philosophical matters, regardless of what the weather is outside. We have social engineers that have created a system that allows for people of all walks of life to be able to get those basic needs of Maslow's hierarchy and reach levels of self-actualization. We have, for all practical purposes, here in St. Petersburg, a modern-day Cordoba, a community that is diverse, that provides education for its people, opportunities in such a way that we could produce the greatest thinkers of our time. We could produce mathematicians, philosophers, musicians, engineers. We're producing an entire generation that are considering new lofty ideas that may not have occurred to generations earlier. And yet, there is something wrong. There's something that's really not quite right within our nation, throughout the different communities. Could it be that we have today people still pushing aside the gospel, still pushing aside the teachings of Jesus in the way that the church leaders did back during medieval Spain? Could it be that people are going through the motions of going to church and listening to the gospel, of listening to value-filled sermons, and then setting it all aside and pursuing a course of action that would hurt others? Well, isn't that human nature? Isn't that humanity for us, regardless of the times that we live in, regardless of the nation that we live in? We all are guilty of that. How often have we compartmentalized the teachings that we know are right and wrong to pursue something that would benefit us, something that would make us stand out a little bit better, regardless of what it may cost somebody else? And so, regardless of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, something is missing. Something is completely missing. We could go ahead and create a society that is perfect in so many ways, but we could still create voices within our community that promote hate and division. We could create bubbles of fascist thoughts. Now, I know that the critic here in the room is saying, Guillermo, you're making too far-fetched of an analogy. You're comparing medieval Spain and the Inquisition to life in America. We would never, ever become that. There's no way that we could have such a detrimental fascist movement within our own nation, where it's a completely different culture. And you're right, in many ways. Thank God. Thank God we would not have such a large-scale inquisition. But maybe it's happening at a much smaller level. Maybe it's happening in very much smaller degrees. Now, I don't have to go too far back in human history. I don't have to go too far back in U.S. history. It was 3 years ago that in Charleston, South Carolina, a young man walked into a church and shot 9 African Americans who were doing Bible study strictly for the purposes of starting a race war. It was about a year ago that people marched through Charlottesville, Virginia, with flags and banners. There were swastikas and Confederate flags, chanting hateful words. And I go and I take a look at this and I go, do those people go to church? Do they have a pastor? Have they not read the gospel of Jesus? And chances are that many of them have. Many of them do. But they're committing the same mistake, the same sin that was committed during medieval Spain, and that is pushing aside the teachings of Jesus and saying this does not pertain now. This is something that's not important at this moment. It's not just fascist people that do this, by the way. I think most of us do this in one form or another. There is, you may have heard me say this before in sermons past. There's a view that humanity is good, that every individual, if that person will come across a child that is stuck in the abyss of a hole, and that down, imagine a well, and the child is stuck in a well, how many people would stop everything they're doing to rescue the child? And the answer is, if not everybody, 99%. People would just stop everything that they're doing to rescue a child that has fallen down the hole. That is proof that humanity is good. But something happens when we get together. Something happens when we get behind boardrooms and decisions that are being made in a collective, when we start weighing losses and gains. And now the decisions change. And decisions are made by corporations that sometimes damage the welfare of children. I want you to consider AIDS medication. Turns out that in 1999, there was a new pill that was put together by the pharmaceuticals to treat AIDS. And that this would improve the lives of hundreds of people, including mothers and children that were ravaged with AIDS. And the pharmaceutical companies had a price on that pill. They developed it. It cost them money. It is part of the business. We're going to sell it at a cost. South Africa, at the time, was ravaged with AIDS. South Africa was riddled. Something like 82% of their residents had AIDS. And so they approached the pharmaceutical companies and say, please, save us. Give us this medication at an affordable price. And the pharmaceutical company said, okay, we'll give it to you at $9 a pill. Now, for a South African, you might as well say that's $1 million, because it was completely out of their grasp. And so they started with the legal community to see how they could bring down that price. And they begged them. They said, our children are dying. Won't you please lower the price? And the pharmaceutical company said, absolutely not. In the meantime, South Africa decided to buck the system and do something that is legally incorrect. They created their own version of it. They created their own generic version of that pill. And they say, you know what? Forget it. We have it now, and we're going to give it to our people for free. And so then they had to be sued in the international court because they illegally manufactured a pill that had a patent. But at the same time, they were saving the lives of the people by giving them the medication for free. Which one's which? Which one is following the heart of the gospel? And which one is following tradition? Jesus is saying in this passage, do not follow tradition blindly. Jesus is saying in this passage, examine your decisions, examine what you're doing, and examine it by looking at your hearts. Is your heart in line with the gospel? Are you making decisions that are in line with the Spirit of God? And tradition may push us. Traditions in business, traditions in life, traditions throughout, to go down a certain path. This is a call for intentional living. This is a call for us to take a look at what's in our hearts. To not just say the words, I love you, but to mean those words, I love you. To not just mean the words, I love you, but to live the words, I love you. And so on this day, as we examine our hearts and take a closer look at what hides in there, on this day, as we take a look at the many different ways that our society unites and brings together and our society divides, let us make an intentional choice to live in accordance with the Spirit of God. Let us examine our hearts and see what is it that Jesus is calling us to do, and how is our life in accordance with it. Amen.